The individual had exhausted all animal body forms. Body forms in states of awareness with emotional responses that moved experience and lifetimes and body forms along. Then consciousness expanding to set up, perhaps inadvertently, a situation where more of the faculties of the experiencing creating vehicle are brought to bear, and consequently that individual will now project into a future lifetime experience reflecting the cause. The never before utilized mental vehicle that will have that individual in a future lifetime, where it must now use even more so the full capacity of the created vehicle. And at this point we can say the individual will be in a body form and experience where the full use of the vehicle mechanics is required, and they will undoubtedly do so. Like a child in a candy store, the individual now accessing these mechanics it never utilized before will set about creating at a frenzy, forging experiences never before encountered, encouraged on by a drive to expand consciousness. At this point then, free will is not so much granted or given as it is chosen and decided due to the consciousness of an individual developing to a point that it cannot develop further. It cannot forge new experiences that will move it along unless it fires up the full capacity of its experience generating a created self, and all the aspects of it, mental, emotional, etc. Perhaps at this early stage of the assumption of such a vehicle, an individual will be reckless, like a bull in a china shop, until they begin to gather experience and references that regulate the behaviour, that everything has consequences, that to murder someone will have you jailed or executed, etc. In fact, this may explain to an extent the nature of a murderer, what makes an individual so. Perhaps an individual who is fresh from the animal kingdom, newly acquiring its first human body, or one of its first ones, and is creating without concern for consequence, has no references to draw from that may moderate behaviour. Then a trip to the gallows, and with that stored in the causal database, less likely the behaviours that took them there will be repeated. From an objective perspective, we can see it's all experience. That is what the simulator is designed for after all. And all experience will move the individual along, especially if the experience is new. This is how consciousness expands, through new experience generated, and the need to deal with the experience with no references to draw upon. Everything then is about expansion, consciousness speaking, and the experience will reflect the nature of the consciousness expanding ideas being created. And in the same way, as free will is activated due to saturation of experience with animal forms lacking this creative free will, so too will real awareness come into being for the individual who exhausts all experiences and reaches saturation of experiences through the free will process of creating. Consciousness reaches perhaps as far as it can in the simulator. If it has exhausted everything the simulator has to offer, where else can it go? It must stagnate then, and remain where it is. And as consciousness continued and sought to expand, the overall experiences will reflect this expansion also. Expansion into body forms and circumstances that allow a greater expression of being in the simulator. The opposite holds true also. If consciousness is not allowed to expand, if it is restricted, if the ideas agreed with overall are of a restrictive nature, that effects a stagnation of the overall consciousness, and consequently the experience will reflect this consciousness restriction. The very simulator will go into a demise and decline. We will have far greater numbers of black holes swallowing up the universe, as the restriction is reflected as a great blackness engulfing and deteriorating the creational simulator to the final conclusion of the simulator imploding. And so, if reaching experiential saturation or being restricted resulted in a stagnation and consciousness remaining where it was, this would be so, were it not for the fact that consciousness is only of the created self. And when a moment comes of consciousness expansion peaking, experiential saturation attained, naturally then the next step is a connection to the real awareness of the real self, which oversees the created consciousness self in its created simulator. At this point, an individual is usually dabbling in magics and other such areas, consciousness seeking to explore and generate experience never before had, and this is where the real universal guides will recognize these telltale signs, the want for further expansion that the simulator can no longer provide, and by that want will the guides have agreement to feature in the individual's experience, and give them the opportunity to connect with their real awareness, their real selves, that reside in the true reality of the all is, the connection being via the new you song, and a gradual process then, where the individual begins to recognize they are a free being of real light, and that what they have always known was but a simulated, created self, and indeed the whole purpose of the simulation and all these millions of lifetimes was to reach this point, to recognize their real awareness, and with focus and intent to assume a universal positioning with the ease. As ever, it is always an individual's choice. They are the decider of everything in creation and beyond it. They must decide then to stand real with this true reality, to recognize they already are with the ease, and all the experiences they have had, and all the experiences they now will be given by the guides, they can use as comparisons, the means by which to recognize the all is, which understandably is quite the journey, after millions of lifetimes, of thinking the created self is what we are, and generating endless experiences. We must now cease our creating, and more so connect with our real selves, and with recognition of the is, we can supersede creation. And as we have our recognition now, we no longer need the created self, as it has served its purpose. The real self considers nothing. It wants or desires nothing. Just like the all is, it resides within. It is in a state of being. Even though it is in this state of being, before beginning its long journey through creation, and all the lifetimes it has there, the real self is unable to recognize the is. We might say then that it cannot recognize itself. A curious situation. From the personal self, of course, the real self would find nothing curious about anything. It simply is. It seems that beings initially start with the is in this being-isness state, but are unable to perceive themselves, or where they are. There would be nothing to perceive in actuality. It would be a state of being-isness. There wouldn't even be differentiation between individuals and the all-is they find themselves in. If everything is, and one becomes so, there can be no boundaries, no levels, or means by which to compare one thing with something else, no lines in the ground that separate regions and planes. There would be no separation between individuals. Rather hard to imagine from the personal self, a personal self that has a linear processor of a literal mind that sees everything as separate from individuals to places to individual experiences. Nevertheless, an awareness is in this state, a newly formed awareness with the is, and as such cannot recognize where it is, as everything is, and so without this required real awareness recognition, it might be like being in a room and unable to see anything. Perhaps it might be like being in a strange void for the is-dwelling individual, but the considerations of strangeness and curiosity, puzzlement and frustration wouldn't be so, for our newly formed being in the is simply is, and so thinks, feels, and is concerned about nothing. What would be its motivation for wanting to change this curious, from a personal perspective, state of affairs, if it simply is and wants or desires nothing? Perhaps it would remain like this indefinitely, not desiring anything, having no want to recognize the state it is and where it is at. And yet there can only be two states available for an individual: a state of being isness with the all is, and a state of being not so, a state that only can be experienced in the creational simulator. For only with the personal created self, only with the mechanics that make up its construction, can an individual decide not to stand in the nowness, this state of being isness. Absent then of a created personal self, as awareness would be before creating one and placing it in the simulator, an individual awareness would automatically be in the state of being isness, in the new nowness of the all is. But it seems unable to recognize itself or its position, unable to recognize this being isness. It's almost as though it is required that it makes this creation, this version of itself, that ultimately can return to the all is, once shedding its created vehicle, and almost a case that it can only recognize itself and the is it already is in, if it perceives itself through the recognitional perception of itself, this version of itself that it created. And once it recognizes itself through itself, it recognizes the is, because it and everything is. There is no separation or distinction, and the two parts merge, and now this real awareness stands in full recognition. A being isness, a state of being everything there can be, a state that must be beyond the imagination of the personal self. For all the personal self can imagine is based on its perception of segregation, separation, and interaction between individual units of awareness. The imagination cannot conceive of such a state which would be everything, no boundaries, no limitations, just a being state that incorporates everything. In such a state, nothing could be considered that could be added, no thought or emotionally based notion. How can you add or consider anything else on top of a state of everything?